This episode of Still Unanswered begins with a photo you will never see here, a wedding invitation, printed and addressed, the date circled in both hope and habit, August 14th, 2009. The groom-to-be is a medical student, orderly, punctual, described by classmates as quiet and focused. The next thing we know, in less than a week, the name attached to that invitation is also attached to a headline, Craigslist Killer. I'm Elena Morales. Today, we go slowly through the week in April 2009 that upended 3 lives, a community, and the idea that the internet was just a convenience. We will trace what is known, what investigators found, and what remains, still unanswered. Let me be clear at the start. This episode is not an exercise in sensational portraiture. We will center the victims, Tricia Lessler and Julissa Brisman, and the third woman who survived an attempted abduction, and we will hold the facts we have against the larger, harder questions about motive, about why institutions missed warning signs, and about how anonymity on the internet mattered. But because part of understanding is psychological context, I invited a forensic psychologist to help us consider what the patterns might mean. Dr. Aaron Feldman joins me. Aaron, welcome.
Thanks, Elena. I appreciate the invitation. I want to say at the outset, cases like this are messy. We have evidence, we have testimony, and we have a human life that ended before the system could produce a verdict. That absence, the missing trial, changes how we interpret the whole story.
Exactly. So let's start with a short timeline, the backbone. Philip Markoff was born in 1986 in Sherrill, New York. The son of a dentist, grew up All-American, National Honor Society, college at SUNY Albany, then Boston University School of Medicine. Engaged to Megan McAllister, wedding planned for August 14, 2009. Then, in April of 2009, 3 incidents across 7 days. April 10, an escort named Tricia Lessler is robbed, bound with zip ties, but survives. April 14, Julissa Brisman, a masseuse, is found mortally wounded in a Boston Marriott room. April 16, another woman, an exotic dancer, is attacked in a Rhode Island hotel and escapes. 4 days later, April 20, Philip is arrested after police trace digital footprints. He's indicted, he pleads not guilty. And a year and some months later, he dies by suicide in jail, before a trial. This is the skeleton. Aaron, when you look at a roughly week-long sequence like that, what jumps out to you?
The compression of time is striking. 3 incidents in 7 days is an escalation pattern. Clinically, that can mean a few things. Someone discovering a behavioral template that works and repeats it, someone who's escalating in boldness and perhaps in impulsivity, or someone who is experiencing stressors, financial, interpersonal, that precipitate a series of acts. The other piece that stands out is the mix of planning and improvisation. He used prepaid phones and anonymous emails, went to hotels, used flex cuffs, so there was premeditation. But the violence in the Brisman case suggests something beyond pure instrumental robbery. That contradiction matters.
I want listeners to hold both those possibilities. This might have been a robber seeking quick cash, or something darker, sexualized control or rage. We simply can't say with certainty. But we can go deeper into the victims' stories because they get flattened in headlines. Aaron, would you mind if I start and you jump in when psychology or context helps?
Please do. And call me Aaron. As always, we'll talk candidly, but respectfully.
Tricia Lessler. She was 29, from Las Vegas, in Boston briefly for work. She advertised escort services on Craigslist. On April 10th, a man arrived at her room at the Westin Copley Place. He produced a handgun, bound her with zip ties and gagged her, took cash and cards, and threatened her life. She later said what saved her was complete compliance. "I just complied with everything he wanted me to do," she said. She wasn't sexually assaulted, at least public records don't indicate it, and when the man left, she freed herself and called for help. She survived.
Her survival is important to emphasize. Victims of robbery or sexualized violence who comply often live to tell about the encounter. That testimony becomes central to building a pattern. Her description of the man, tall, cap, baseball hat, later matched surveillance from other hotels. But also, psychologically, her account suggests the offender was focused on control and quick extraction. He wanted what he wanted, then left.
4 days later, the pattern grows fatal. Julissa Brisman, 25, worked as a masseuse and had an ad. She was in a Marriott room on the 20th floor. Neighbors heard the struggle. Security entered and found she had been beaten and shot. She died. It was, by many accounts, a savage, quick ending. Friends described her as trying to build a stable life. Julissa's death is the emotional center of the case for many people.
Julissa's death raises the motive question in its rawest form. If the first incident was a robbery where the offender used a gun and restraint but left the victim alive, what changed on April 14? There are a few possibilities. One is reactive violence. Perhaps she resisted in a way that changed the dynamic. Another is escalation. The offender overreached, or the act became more than instrumental. The presence of multiple head wounds, firing at close range, all of that suggests either rage or the need to eliminate a witness. But again, we're working with limited public forensic detail.
And then, 2 days after that, another attempted robbery in Warwick, Rhode Island. An exotic dancer escapes when someone knocks at the door. Surveillance again shows the same body type. Police start to connect the dots. And this is where the digital trace becomes crucial. Investigators pulled Craigslist logs, IP addresses, email accounts. One IP traced to an apartment in Quincy where Philip Markoff and his fiancée Megan lived. On April 20th, they stopped the car on I-95. He was arrested. Megan asked if there'd been a mistake. That moment, the ordinary couple driving down a highway exploded into national news.
From an investigative perspective, it's a textbook use of digital footprints. Server logs and phone records provide a link between online interactions and a physical location. It's also a cautionary signal. Anonymity in online platforms can be pierced by the combination of investigative techniques and cooperation from companies. But we must remember, too, digital traces are powerful, but they are not motive or mind. They tell us that someone used those channels. They don't resolve the why.
We should talk about what police found in the Quincy apartment, the so-called kit that made people in the press call him predatory. Reports say they found more than 60 plastic flex cuffs, duct tape, a handgun, and 16 pairs of women's underwear that didn't belong to Megan. Some sources say the gun was hidden inside a hollowed-out book or a sock. There were laptops with records of messages and prepaid phones. Aaron, as a clinician, what do you make of that collection?
Objects like that can serve several psychological functions. Flex cuffs, duct tape, a gun, they enable a certain behavior, restraint and threat. The underwear is more complex. Trophies or keepsakes can be signs of compulsive taking, or they might speak to fetishistic behaviors. Clinically, when we see a combination of preparatory tools plus items implying repeated contact with multiple partners, it suggests patterning over time. That raises the question, were there other victims? Items alone don't confirm assault, but they suggest encounters beyond those 3 reported in April.
Right. So, one of the still unanswered threads is whether April was a first outbreak of violence or the month that finally revealed a longer pattern. Investigators reportedly followed leads to see if there were other unreported incidents. Nothing publicly confirmed further murders, but the underwear and records make some people think there were other robberies or assaults that never made it into public files. That ambiguity leaves a lot of people unsatisfied.
It does. And there's a social angle as well. Many sex workers don't report crimes for fear of arrest, stigma, or because they distrust law enforcement. So if an offender targets people who are less likely to report, the official record can undercount incidents. That's an institutional blind spot.
Let's pause there. I want to be sure we center Julissa and Tricia as full people, not just data points. Julissa's family said she was hardworking and trying to build a life. Tricia survived and spoke about compliance as survival strategy. And the third woman, often unnamed in the press, lived through an attempted abduction. Their experiences changed their families and communities. The label Craigslist Killer can obfuscate that. Aaron, how does the label shape public understanding?
Labels like that are double-edged. On one hand, they create a simple narrative the public can grasp. An internet predator preyed on people via Craigslist. That gets attention, prompts policy action, and raises safety awareness. On the other hand, it can flatten complex realities, the social vulnerabilities of sex workers, the varied motives behind violence, and the fact that most people using Craigslist did not face lethal risk. Psychology tells us that a catchy label helps people process fear, but it can also misdirect policy, focusing on the platform rather than on underlying issues like stigma, access to safe working conditions, and mental health evaluation.
Think about Megan McAllister for a moment. She was a volunteer partner from college, the woman engaged to him. In the early days, she publicly defended Philip, saying she couldn't reconcile the image with the crime she was hearing about. Then, as evidence came out, the flex cuffs, the underwear, the gun, she broke off the engagement. It's reported that Markoff attempted suicide soon after. Later, he would die by suicide in custody on August 15, 2010, a day after the wedding date had passed. He wrote Megan's name in blood, placed photos of them in the cell. It's a haunting tableau. What do you interpret from those acts?
Symbolic acts around relationships can mean many things. The timing of his final suicide, the day after his wedding date, suggests a deep connection between the loss of the expected future with Megan and his despair. Creating a tableau with photos and names could be a final attempt to control the narrative or to send a message. Some individuals construct elaborate death scenes as an act of communication more than confession. Others are expressing guilt, shame, or an inability to live with the consequences. Because he died before trial and left no coherent explanatory note, we can't know his internal accounting.
There's also the question of motive more broadly. Public conversations tended to swing between two poles: financial motive, gambling debts and student loans, and sexual sadism, a need for control. Both have some evidentiary support. He did gamble. Police found that he frequented casinos. Robbery of cash and cards points to financial need. At the same time, the kit and the underwear suggest a sexualized or fetishistic component. How do you weigh those possibilities?
I don't think it's an either-or. In many violent cases, motives are multifactorial. Financial stress can be a trigger that intersects with deviant sexual interests or a personality predisposed to risk-taking and manipulation. An offender might begin with a practical aim, steal cash, and then develop a pattern in which the act itself becomes reinforcing for reasons beyond money. The presence of trophies or ritualistic behavior moves us toward sexualized or revenge motivations, but the initial spark can be material. Without a full psychological autopsy or trial testimony, any single explanation is provisional. Without a full psychological autopsy or trial testimony, any single explanation is provisional.
You mentioned personality predisposition. Many early profiles in the press used words like sociopath or psychopath, but those are loaded terms. From your perspective, what can we responsibly say about his personality? What are the limits of profiling here?
Profiling has limits. We can say some behavioral observations. He maintained a public persona, studious, engaged, organized, while allegedly carrying out clandestine activities. That capacity to compartmentalize is a hallmark of some antisocial or narcissistic patterns, but it's not diagnostic. What is more useful clinically is looking for patterns of empathy deficits, impulsivity, deception, and premeditation. He displayed organized behavior, planning, concealment, alongside apparent emotional blunting in public. That combination can fit those profiles. But remember, a label doesn't explain motive, and it can hinder empathy for victims if it becomes spectacle.
Let's turn to the investigative side briefly, the way the police used digital data. You mentioned Craigslist server logs and IP addresses. In 2009, the idea that something as casual as a classified site could be weaponized into a killing spree was a new kind of moral panic. But today, there's more awareness of online risks. Do you think the internet fundamentally created new opportunities, or did it simply enable old predators in new ways?
Both. The internet lowers transaction friction. It makes it easier to find people whose work involves in-person contact. For sex work, that's huge. Ads, messaging, anonymity. That's not new criminality. It's an older pattern of luring vulnerable people that moved to a new platform. But the scale and reach changed. Also, the sense of anonymity can embolden actors who might have been deterred in face-to-face contexts. Importantly, online platforms can also provide evidence trails that help investigators. Server logs, IPs, timestamps. So the net effect is mixed. The internet sometimes facilitates crime, but also leaves a forensic breadcrumb trail we didn't have before.
And that breadcrumb trail is what led them to Philip. But then we move into questions of what the courts never answered. Markoff pleaded not guilty and never faced a jury because he died in custody. That means the evidence never faced cross-examination the way it would have at trial. What does that absence do to public understanding and to justice?
It leaves a vacuum that often gets filled by speculation and narrative. The prosecution had a case strong enough to indict. Ballistics tied a gun to the scene, digital records linked him to the ads, physical evidence was found in the apartment. But a trial also allows for defense challenges, chain of custody, alternative explanations for the items found, contextual testimony about digital privacy and account sharing. In the absence of a trial, we have a public verdict. People often assume guilt, but legally, he remained charged, not convicted. For families, that can be double-edged. Some feel justice was never completed. Others, particularly victims, still experience closure through the arrest itself. It's complicated.
There's a detail that surfaces in many retellings. At least one report says that in Markoff's apartment, investigators found a handgun and that ballistics linked it to Brisman's murder. Other accounts vary on whether definitive ballistic matches existed or whether questions remained. How should listeners parse inconsistent reporting across outlets?
Carefully, journalistic accounts differ in access to documents and sources. Ballistics can be complex. A weapon can be linked by casings or by microscopic striations. But some reporting conflates preliminary matches with incontrovertible links. The cautious approach is to note what authorities presented at specific times, indictments, public statements, affidavits, and then allow for the uncertainty that comes when a trial never occurs. That's one of the reasons this case fits the still unanswered frame.
We've been talking a lot about Markoff himself. I want to pivot back to systems and context. After high-profile cases like this, there's always pressure on platforms, Craigslist in this case, to change. Craigslist eventually shuttered its erotic services sections in the United States, and public pressure around moderation grew. But critics say such closures can push sex work underground, making workers less safe. How should platforms balance safety and autonomy?
It's a thorny policy issue. Removing visible channels might reduce easily searchable targets, but it also reduces the ability of sex workers to screen clients, to publicize boundaries, and to create some degree of predictability. A safer approach requires multiple levers: better moderation and reporting tools, partnerships with local organizations that support worker safety, mechanisms for identity verification that don't create surveillance hazards, and law enforcement practices that encourage reporting from vulnerable communities. Blaming the platform alone overlooks structural issues: poverty, lack of safe employment, and the criminalization that pushes people into riskier spaces.
That's an important point. In reporting on this case in 2009, the conversation often simplified to "the internet is to blame" or "Craigslist killed people." But as you and I have both said, labeling obscures complexity. We also should consider how media coverage treated the victims. Julissa's life was often reduced to her job or to lurid detail, rather than presented as a person with a family. How can journalists and podcasters do better?
Focus on humanity. Use victims' names and stories beyond their profession. Include context about economic pressures and systemic vulnerabilities. Avoid implying that sex work in itself makes someone less deserving of empathy or protection. And when you're dealing with allegations without a verdict, be precise about what is proven versus alleged. That maintains ethical standards and respects survivors and families.
We've spent a lot of time on motive, evidence, and systems. I want to circle back to a question that unsettles me. He staged his death scene with Megan's name and photos. Is that control? A message? Some final attempt to claim innocence? Or is it pathologic grief? Aaron?
All those interpretations are plausible. From a clinical lens, inserting a loved one's name into a final act can be an attempt to hold someone responsible for the loss, blaming, guilt, or pleading. It can also be an act of self-legitimization. Remember me how I was before. In some cases, it's spectacle, making sure the world links the suicide to the person or event he believed mattered most. Without a note explaining it, these gestures remain symbolic, open to many readings. That ambiguity is part of why this case continues to haunt people.
Let's talk about another piece we've skirted. What if there were other victims? The underwear, the prepared materials in the apartment, those items suggest patterning. Investigators reportedly looked for additional incidents, but publicly confirmed none. For families of possible other victims, that ongoing uncertainty is brutal. What can be done years later to find answers?
Cold cases can sometimes be revisited if new forensic techniques, new witnesses, or renewed investigative will emerges. A few practical steps. Cross-referencing hotel incident reports from casinos and hotels where he frequented, re-examining digital records if preserved, and contacting community organizations that support sex workers to surface unreported incidents. But resource constraints and the passage of time make new discoveries harder. Also, families and survivors may not want renewed public attention, so investigators must balance the search for answers with respect for privacy.
Aaron, you consult for public defenders. How would you approach a defense of someone like Philip if you were at the table, given the evidence as reported? I'm not asking you to argue him innocent. I'm asking how the justice system uses defense to test evidence.
Good question. A defense attorney's role is to test the prosecution's case, to probe chain of custody of evidence, to challenge whether items seized were lawfully obtained, to cross-examine witnesses about consistency, and to introduce alternative explanations for the digital trail, for example, shared devices, spoofed IP addresses, or third-party access. They would also investigate motive, mental state, and any mitigating circumstances. The point of adversarial testing is to make sure the facts meet the legal standard beyond a reasonable doubt. The absence of that process in this case leaves a lot of the public's questions unresolved.
Listeners, we're about halfway through our program. I want to invite you to think about the uncomfortable gaps here. We have a man with a double life, a week-long crime spree, 2 survivors and 1 murder victim, an arrest, evidence that looks damning, and then a death that prevents legal closure. We have policy debates, the internet's role, questions about sex work and stigma, and the intangible human reasons that push someone from compliance to violence. Aaron, if you had to summarize for our listeners 3 responsible takeaways they should hold after hearing the case, 3 things that are true, even amidst uncertainty, what would they be?
1. Patterns tell us something, but patterns are not motive. We can identify escalation and tools used. We can't definitively know why without the person's testimony or fuller psychological autopsy. 2. Victimization isn't evenly visible. People who do this kind of work face barriers to reporting, which shapes official statistics. 3. Platforms matter, but they are one part of a system that includes poverty, stigma, and limited support. Focusing solely on Craigslist would miss larger social drivers.
Those are useful guideposts. Now I want to go deeper into the Brisman murder itself. The crime scene accounts described striking violence, blunt force, and gunshots at close range. Neighbors said they heard thuds and screams. Security did the right thing by gaining entry when they were alerted, but the question remains. Did the offender plan to kill, or was murder an unplanned result of a struggle? Do we have enough forensic detail to pick between those?
Forensic detail matters. Number of entry and exit wounds, trajectory, defense wounds, DNA evidence, and the condition of the room can point toward planned lethal intent versus an escalating struggle. Public records say she was bludgeoned and shot, with items scattered, which can indicate a chaotic struggle. Firing at close range can be both a method to ensure death and a sign of panic. Without the full autopsy report publicly available, and without a trial to argue those findings, we can't decisively pick one explanation. That's one of the episode's central, still unanswered points.
One detail that keeps coming up in reports is his gambling. He'd visited casinos and apparently had financial stress from student loans. Prosecutors suggested robbery could be a motive. But Aaron, statistically, do people in gambling debt turn to violent crime? Or is that an outlier narrative that journalists reach for?
Most people in gambling debt don't commit violent crimes. That's crucial. Financial strain can increase risk behaviors and desperation, but violence involves many more factors: dispositional, situational, and opportunity-related. When a person already has deviant sexual interests or a predilection for control, financial stress might lower internal barriers to acting out. But presenting gambling as a simple causal chain to murder overstates the correlation. It can be part of a constellation, but rarely a sole or sufficient explanation.
I want to shift gears and discuss cultural impact. After this case, there were books, TV movies, and a media feeding frenzy. Titles like 7 Days of Rage and the Lifetime movie dramatized the events, often emphasizing a monster hiding among us theme. How do dramatizations like this help or harm public understanding?
They help by raising awareness and humanizing victims if done ethically. But they harm when they simplify, sensationalize, or exploit. Dramatizations tend to conflate alleged facts with fictional reconstructions for narrative tension. That can re-traumatize families, skew public understanding of forensic complexity, and create moral panics that lead to knee-jerk policy rather than measured reform. Responsible storytelling should prioritize victims' dignity and highlight structural issues, not just spectacle.
Listeners, we'll take a short pause in the story to surface an often overlooked perspective, that of sex workers, and how they were portrayed. In the coverage, there was a tendency to depict victims primarily by their profession, as if that alone explained their risk. Aaron, how should we reframe that approach?
Reframe by centering lived experience. Report on their families, their aspirations, the reasons they worked the jobs they did. Include voices from advocacy groups that represent sex workers, and acknowledge structural reasons, economic inequality, lack of healthcare access, criminalization, that push people into riskier circumstances. Destigmatizing language and avoiding moral judgments makes for clearer understanding and better policy responses.
Thank you. Now, let's walk through the final months and his death in detail, because it matters to the unanswered narrative. In custody, Markoff attempted suicide multiple times. He was placed on suicide watch at least twice. Then, on August 15, 2010, he used a makeshift blade to cut his neck and arms, wrapped a plastic bag over his head, and attempted to block his airway, and left a bloody display with Megan's name. Officials ruled it suicide. That decision closed the criminal case in one sense, but left the allegations untested. Aaron, what does a death like that do to public memory of a case?
It fixes the case into a tragic, unresolved narrative. For some, the suicide is seen as an admission of guilt. For others, it's a final tragedy of a person who might have had mental health crises. The inability to have a trial means important questions about evidence, motive, and accountability remain unaddressed. For victims' families, it can mean no legal closure. For the public, it can deepen speculation and myth-making. That's why responsible retelling matters.
Let me ask a blunt question. Given everything we've discussed, the evidence found in the apartment, the digital trail, the witness accounts, the violent escalation, do you, personally, feel comfortable saying he was guilty? I'll add, answer as a psychologist weighing patterns, not as a juror. Aaron?
As a psychologist looking at patterns, I see a converging set of indicators that are strongly suggestive. The digital footprint aligning him with the postings, the tools for restraint, the weapon associated with the scene, and the surveillance footage linking him to hotel appearances. Those points collectively are convincing. But from a legal and ethical perspective, without a verdict, we must be careful about categorical statements. Clinically, the pattern is consistent with someone who would do this, but I try to keep professional humility about definitive statements in the absence of a trial.
That humility is important. I think many listeners will hear that and understand why the case continues to sit in a gray zone. Before we move to closing, I want to offer listeners a set of reflective prompts, questions to carry forward. 1.
What does it mean for justice if someone accused of killing another dies before trial? 2. How do we balance platform responsibility with workers' safety and rights? 3. What do we owe victims who are often dehumanized in coverage? Aaron, one last professional note. If you were advising a university or medical school on spotting warning signs among students without stigmatizing normal stress, what would you suggest?
I'd recommend a multi-tiered approach. First, robust mental health services and confidential counseling so students can seek help for gambling, depression, or compulsive behaviors without fear. Second, faculty training to spot radical changes in behavior, withdrawal, secrecy, sudden financial distress, and to refer rather than punish. Third, policies that require compassionate interventions when students show signs of dangerous preoccupation, combined with due process. The aim is early help, not surveillance.
We're approaching the end of our episode. Before we sign off, Aaron, is there something you wish the public understood about cases like this that often gets lost?
I wish people would understand complexity. Humans are rarely simple villains or victims. When we paint in black and white, we miss the systems that enable harm and the needed responses that help prevent future tragedies. That means investing in mental health, destigmatizing help-seeking, protecting vulnerable workers, and creating thoughtful platform policy that centers safety without criminalizing people who need support.
Thank you, Aaron, and thank you for joining us today. To close, a few notes. The public record of this case lives in contemporaneous reporting, court documents, and investigative journalism. Because Philip Markoff died before trial, many of the questions we've raised will likely remain unsettled. But unsettled is not the same as unknowable. Some questions have answers we can pursue, and some answers will always be partial. The point of Still Unanswered is not to leave you with sensational certainties, but with careful curiosity. If you want to read more, the sources we relied on include contemporary reporting in the New York Times and Boston Globe, investigative pieces on CBS and ABC, as well as later books that documented the case. I'll post a comprehensive source list in the episode notes. Before we let you go, Julissa Brisman had a life beyond the headlines. Tricia Leffler survived and carried that memory forward. The unnamed woman in Rhode Island walked away and lived. Their stories deserve more than an eponymous headline. They deserve to be remembered as people who were harmed, not as symbols of a media catchphrase.
And remember, if anything discussed here resonates personally, if you're struggling with impulsive behaviors, gambling, or violent thoughts, reach out for help. Local mental health services, crisis lines, and support groups can provide confidential assistance. Prevention and help are available.
That's it for today's episode of Still Unanswered. I'm Elena Morales. Aaron, thank you again.
Thank you, Elena. Take care.
If you found this episode meaningful, please consider supporting independent investigative audio. We'll be back next week with another case where the facts invite more questions than answers. Until then, remember to hold the nuance.